What's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast. I am Connor O'Gara. Will, we are back after a mini break, ready to talk some pigskin today. But before we do, we're going to get into Brent Venables, that extension. News came out Friday that I think raised some eyebrows. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff with Jesse Simonton, things related to the Heisman, Ole Miss, Walter Nolen, different storylines. And then we'll end with Lad of the Week. But Will, I had this realization driving back from Fort Myers, and it hit me when I got into a gas station and I was solo, which solo on a road trip for me has been such a rare occurrence in the last 9 years of my life that I don't want to say I had a panic attack in a gas station, but I was scrambling looking for a go-to gas station snack. And I had already eaten, so there's the context. I had eaten lunch a couple hours ago. I needed something to kind of keep me awake a little bit better than just, podcast or music or something like that. And I was like, I need something a little bit sweet. But I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I ended up just getting a panic pick of fruit snacks. And I felt so stupid. What should I have done in that spot?
Beef jerky.
I should have. Dang. I told myself something sweet would be great. But then I also told myself, I'm going to get something that I never have with Lauren. Lauren's not a big fruit snacks person or anything like that. Lauren also not a big beef jerky person. I am. If beef jerky were $6.99 a bag at the grocery store or something like that, I would get it every single time. I think it's that good. That's the easy answer, but it's the right answer, I think.
Yeah, and you can get a little bit of sweet and sour going on. The thing about beef jerky is it smells terrible. So it's the best to have when you're by yourself because you have no one to shame. So I think that's a pretty open and shut case. I think, for me, I'll go beef jerky, something with some caffeine, right? If it's earlier in the day, maybe I'll, it just depends, right? Like you never want to really mix coffee and beef jerky. So maybe I'll do like a coffee course, hang it out, maybe hit a chip, go back to the beef jerky, kind of like a pitcher selecting their rotation. But then, there's nothing better than the energy drink of your choice, mixed with the beef jerky, dudes being dudes, alone in the car, blaring some Creed, you know what I'm saying? And have no one to judge you, no one to smell you, no one to see you, just living in your own little ozone layer right there.
The energy drink dilemma, the coffee dilemma was something that probably initiated my mini panic attack because I also told myself it's like 3:30. I've got 2 more hours left on this drive. I'm just stopping, got to use the facilities real quick and just need something to keep me awake. And I always think that if I have caffeine after 2:30, it's just going to keep me up all night. Even now at this stage of dad life, I still tell myself that. But man, I was in no man's land, and it was a really, really weird place to be. I didn't have, like usually Lauren's there to be like, maybe she's already got an idea of something that she wants, and then I'm able to kind of pair off that. But somebody listening to this can relate to the exact dilemma of solo road trip that felt so unbelievably unfamiliar. But we got through it. Yeah. Snacks were fine.
Got a little Josh Heupel in your game, right? The scripted plays, always very good. When we get off script, you just never know what's going to happen there.
Over on script, where you can score against the 85 Bears, man. We can do it. But yeah, give me off script. It's a problem.
I have a road trip question for you that I've started to ask you a couple of times. So maybe I'm an insane person, but do you ever find yourself just like developing rivalries with other cars when you're on a road trip? Like maybe I'm just like that type of dude, but like somebody cuts you off, right? And like I'm like mentally I put a tracking dart on them, and I'm like, I want to see where this ultimately gets you now that you've cut me off. I want to see how far ahead. Like if I never see you again, good job, you made the right choice. But usually that person will cut you off and they'll get stuck in your orbit for a little bit, and you kind of give them a little head nod, like glad you did that. Does that happen to you too?
A little bit. My dad, when we were in the car and he would get cut off by somebody, not necessarily road trip scenario, but my dad would often say, "See you at the light, bro." That was his default every single time. And then, sure enough, every single time we'd see him at the light, and I'd be like, I guess speeding in this area, going 55 and a 40 didn't really get that person where they wanted to go. Yeah, I make mental notes all the time. I do. I am the type of person where I will think to myself, they're really herky-jerky and I don't want to follow them. And I just want to get away from them. I'm either going to like speed past them and I look like I'm speeding past them on the right side or something. Or I will get into a bit of a rivalry. I'll be like, I'm probably just going to see you in 10 miles anyway. Or if you're going too slow for me, then I just hope everyone passes you and everyone shames you. Not flip you off, but just shames you into what you're doing right now.
Yeah, I've found it's often the vans and the like now at this point 2000s kind of like crappy cars that will take these unnecessary risks on the freeway, bro, like
Yeah.
the interstate, and they always take the risks and when it's 2 lanes. You know what I'm saying? They always take these crazy risks that could get in a car wreck. And then my joke is always, I'll see you when it turns 3 lanes, because these people never want to go fast. They never want to hit 90 and actually take the risk. They just want to win that little rep where it doesn't really matter. So it's like it'll widen out to 3 lanes. You'll see this car that's just cut off 8 people behind you, and you're like, bro, what little game of Tetris? Like, what was the purpose of making all those people mad?
Then you get the motorcycle that's got to do the
Oh,
nutmeg, and you're just like, wait 3 more seconds, guy. Like
yeah.
it'll be fine. It'll be okay. Okay, that was a mini figuring out for the people. Haven't done a figuring out in a minute. That was a good one for you. All right, let's talk about this Brent Venables extension. On Friday, Pete Thamel tweets, quote, sources, Oklahoma has agreed to a new 6-year contract for coach Brent Venables. The new 6-year deal includes a significant raise for Venables, and there's been an uptick in overall program commitment as OU heads to the SEC, close
Mm-hmm.
quote. I had a lot of thoughts on that, but most importantly was how significant that raise was for Venables. Drink every time you hear me say the word significant on today's show. After all, I mean, let's think about it. This was a guy who I think if you're looking at this from the outside, you can go, he has yet to get to a New Year's Six Bowl at Oklahoma. He went 10-8 against Big 12 competition so far.
Mm-hmm.
And as our guy Shehan Jayaraja pointed out, he was the third Oklahoma coach to lose to Kansas and Oklahoma State in the same season since 1933. I think that was the FDR administration. I think that
Gosh,
was
that's
the
got to be like Great Depression era. Yeah, that's got to be FDR, I feel.
Yeah, it's been a minute. But if we don't want to judge year one coaches and point out that Venables led Oklahoma to its first losing season of the 21st century, if we don't want to say that that's on his resume because that's a year one deal, we would say a coach who led a 4-win improvement getting a, quote, significant raise isn't out of the realm of possibility, especially when you understand that it's a Jimmy Sexton client.
Mm-hmm.
Huge piece of the equation with this. So when I see that tweet from Pete Thamel, I'm, and I'm seeing like also, okay, this isn't a surprise. This has been kind of going back to January. This is not necessarily something that just came out of nowhere. I am still thinking, wow, maybe Oklahoma moved Venables into that $9 million club, which now includes Kalen DeBoer, Kirby
Mm-hmm.
Smart, Mark Stoops, Brian Kelly, Eli Drinkowitz, Lane Kiffin, Josh Heupel, Steve Sarkisian. Those are the SEC coaches who are making at least $9 million in this conference. Okay.
Mark Stoops seems like a great value now. Look at that.
Yeah, you could say that depending on your perspective. If you want
Yeah.
to say $9 million for the best coach in program history, I think if you could tell any college football fan base, hey, you have your best coach in college football history and the going rate is $9 million per year, they'd say, sure, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Even at a place like Kentucky. So I would assume, and maybe I'm incorrect in making this assumption, you know what they say about assumptions, but I would assume that a significant raise would be going from the $7.25 million club up to the $9 million club. Oklahoma, in case you haven't heard, is about to join the SEC this time next week, July 1st, and perhaps they want to make it look like Venables is every bit as valuable as those $9 million coaches in the SEC. More on that in a bit here, okay? But then I saw the terms of the deal from Mason Young. It's a new 6-year contract, which essentially means it's a 2-year extension, right? He was 2 years into his previous 6-year deal. They just tacked 2 years on. He's now signed on through the rest of the decade. Original deal, it went through 2027 and now it's through 2029. And the question that I was very eager to find out was how significant was that raise? In 2024, he's going to make $7.2 million. That in 2025, it jumps up to $7.625 million. 2026, $7.725, and then stays the same in 2027 with $7.725. And then in 2028, it maxes out at $7.825. And then, well, I shouldn't say it maxes out in 2028. Final year of the deal, $7.925 million. That'll be the annual pay in 2029. So at no point of this deal will Venables even join the $8 million club. Instead of maxing out at $7.5 million like he would have on his previous contract, he will max out at $7.925 million. Any of us, okay, I am saying this, any of us would love a world in which we could get an extra $400,000 per year to do our job after just 2 years on that job. Okay. We would all love that. That would be great. But it's only a 5.7% raise. Significant? I don't think so. I don't really think that's significant. Not in this profession. Maybe in our profession it's significant because raises are so difficult to come by, at least in terms of the world of sports media. Even if you're good, excluding like the Stephen A. Smiths of the world who want 25 million bucks. For most of us, no matter what business we're in, we're not making national headlines for a 5.7% raise, or at least we're not allowed to call it significant. That's got Jimmy Sexton written all over it, all over it. If you could like subpoena the text back and forth between Jimmy Sexton and Pete Thamel, I bet in that exact text he had the word significant. Hey, make sure you say this. Everybody always dogs Schefter for basically just copying and pasting these texts that he gets from agents. Pete Thamel's doing the same thing. All right.
Yep.
Same exact thing. That's how Thamel gets this information and shares it to the world hours ahead of Oklahoma having this Board of Regents meeting to be able to approve this contract, which they ultimately did. The Jimmy Sexton masterclass is still in the works here, even if the increase in compensation is far from the most impressive thing that Jimmy Sexton has ever done. What is the most impressive thing that Jimmy Sexton has ever done, you ask? Getting Jimbo Fisher more money than God, that's up there. Getting
Convince you all that Kalen DeBoer was Alabama's first choice.
That's a pretty good Jimmy Sexton masterclass. That's pretty good.
I think Jimbo was always going to get paid because money is paper. It's toilet paper at A&M. I think that spin job, because I brought it up at the time, awesome. The fact that they were like, we didn't even talk to Dan Lanning, and people were like, yeah, that probably happened.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. What about Will Muschamp getting a combined $19 million in buyout money from two different SEC programs? That's Jimmy Sexton masterclass. This is pretty good. I don't want to say that's the first thing on his resume, but it's got to be up there. It has to be. But this is Sexton going to the negotiating table with a plan and recognizing all the moving parts that are in play. It's June. Venables isn't turning down other programs left and right. So everybody always asks, like, oh, who's he competing against, blah, blah, blah. No. This isn't some Lincoln Riley situation, of course, where he's being courted by USC behind closed doors and all those things are happening. But the Riley part is worth mentioning with the Venables extension. I cannot emphasize this enough. And I feel like I say it every single time I talk about Oklahoma, but it is always worth bringing up. Oklahoma is still determined to win the breakout. That is leverage in favor of Brent Venables, and you better believe Jimmy Sexton knows that. He absolutely knows that. OU fans are defensive of him because they want nothing more than for Venables to be competing for a national title after Riley ditched the program because he couldn't win a national title, and Venables was essentially left to pick up the pieces. It would be the ultimate flex if Oklahoma could do this, because Oklahoma knows, hey, we were Oklahoma long before Lincoln Riley was here, and we're going to be Oklahoma long before Lincoln Riley, or long after Lincoln Riley leaves. There was still talent, but Riley tried to bring current players and recruits over to USC, and that stuff stings. It just does. Okay, recruiting. That's the other part of this. This is something that Venables had working in his favor that Jimmy Sexton also recognized. Thamel's follow-up tweet kind of says it all. He links to the ESPN news story on the extension and then adds that Venables has ESPN's number 7 recruiting class for 2025. Athletic directors love the idea of an extension building recruiting momentum. I remember Bill Moose talking about it like 2019, I think. Maybe it was 2018 with Scott Frost. And Scott Frost got this inexplicable extension in 2018, like heading into the home stretch of recruiting. And Bill Moose comes out and says what everybody's thinking of, like, yeah, we were just trying to build a little bit of recruiting momentum. wasn't actually based on anything he was doing on the field, but you know what? You just don't want to have some of these conversations. And athletic directors, it's not money that's coming out of their pocket, and they can do these sort of things to try and push these buttons. I personally would love if there's some way to give a breakdown of that stat, because while I know for certainty that plenty of recruits care about a coach's job security, I don't know that it's something that brings in that much more talent in the way that athletic directors and agents would probably make you think. Oklahoma doesn't need any help in recruiting, But the fact that Venables has had nothing but top 8 classes so far, and it looks like he's in really good shape to have another top 8 class, that's something that Jimmy Sexton could bring to that negotiating table and say, let's work out this extension right now. Say what you will about the is Oklahoma SEC ready question, something that we talked about with Derek Peterson. What everyone can agree on is that there is a certain threshold you need to meet if you are going to emerge from the SEC and compete for national championships. A topic we discussed a lot with Kalen DeBoer. Something, is he going to be able to meet this certain threshold? Is he still going to try and tell you that you can win this way with 3 stars because that's what it looked like at Washington? And I would argue early returns suggest guy recognizes you need to get blue chip talent into the door. TBD on how all of that process works out. Oklahoma is determined to meet that threshold. They want that stability. They recognize there is an uptick that they need to have. Go back to that original tweet from Thamel, the uptick. That's a key part of this. Oklahoma also determined to make sure that nobody, places like this, on places like the Paul Feinbaum show, Andy Staples, wherever, they do not want people going, Brent Venables' job security, man, I don't know that he's locked in for 2025. I don't know. They don't want to have those discussions in their first year in the SEC. As I look at these schedules in the preseason based on how I think teams will perform in 2024, a lot of that's heavily weighted on what they did in 2023. But as I look at this in the preseason, Florida's the only team in America with a tougher schedule than Oklahoma. Maybe that'll change. Chances are that will change. But that's just how this is being viewed right now. Again, when this extension is signed. Maybe that'll change. Maybe the gauntlet won't be quite a gauntlet and it's going to be more favorable. They'll get some breaks with quarterbacks being hurt here or there. Who knows? But this is just as we look at it from the onset. If Oklahoma's 8-4, Will, I feel like I'm going to be defending Oklahoma and wondering how many conference champs across the country Oklahoma could beat. That's what I feel like is something that I probably wouldn't have said a few years ago. And we had all of this proof of Oklahoma continuing to win the Big 12 and then get on this stage and, we see their shortcomings, and this is why they can't beat the SEC on this stage. I think that that changes with the type of team that they could have this year and being on the wrong end of those games year after year and recognizing this is how we have to actually improve and seeing what that could look like over the course of an entire season and not just a one-game sample size. But by giving Venables this extension without a significant raise, I'll disagree with Pete Thamel on that. You're trying to convey a certain message. The message is our guy is progressing, and we believe that he is the right person to lead us into this new era of SEC football. And again, 4-win improvement, that's progressing by any stretch of the imagination. That is a significant improvement. Even if that doesn't feel like the destination for Oklahoma, you still made progress last year. And look, I understand that you were starting at a different place than you ever have in the 21st century. First losing season in the 21st century. The only way to go was up, but still, it is improvement. An athletic director can say these things, and look, they won't even make headlines. A contract extension, that makes headlines. That's acknowledgement of progression. Ahead of an important stretch for Oklahoma, both in joining the SEC, and being able to face all these teams, at media days, make of that what you will. All right. Some of that is just PR and trying to win that war. But, it's an important stretch with recruiting. Today is actually the start of a recruiting dead period that'll go into late July. I'm sure they'd like to be able to get on the right end of that as well. This makes a statement without necessarily giving Brent Venables a blank check. Okay. As Thamel tweeted, possibly straight from the words of Jimmy Sexton as well, there's been an uptick in overall program commitment as OU heads to the SEC.
What does that mean?
Uptick at Oklahoma? Buddy.
Like from the boosters, from the administration, who, the players, what are we talking about here?
It's Oklahoma.
Overall?
How can you have more of an uptick of commitment to the program than what Oklahoma has? All right. But you can spin it in a different way when you do things like this. There is an uptick in commitment to Venables. There is an uptick in buyout under this new deal, which I'm assuming, based on everything that we've seen so far, I haven't seen anything that officially confirms this, but I'm assuming that it didn't suddenly turn a guaranteed contract, a fully guaranteed contract, into a not guaranteed contract, or like a
Right.
partially guaranteed contract, or else that would have made significant headlines and probably defeated the purpose of the extension in the first place. Why would you do that? By the way, a fully guaranteed $43.5 million contract for a first time head coach should probably qualify as Jimmy Sexton masterclass. Okay. Maybe not as high as the Will Muschamp buyout money, but it's pretty tough to do, man. That's
Yeah.
really tough to do.
I gotta give these ADs credit because they keep seeing these deals come through and how terribly they go, and every one of them is just like, sure. Like if you're not at like Alabama or Georgia, you just got to be thinking to yourself, like, how much of this am I going to end up paying? Because nobody just gets to walk off into the sunset anymore.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I'll kind of get to the part with Joe Castiglione, the Oklahoma athletic director, and like kind of how they're hoping this works out. But I guarantee you, their ideal version of this scenario is not looking at the buyout numbers. Okay, that the buyout numbers, we've said over and over again, until you give athletic directors an actual reason to stop agreeing to this, they're going to keep agreeing to them. Okay, and that to me is the only part of this deal that's truly significant. Right? If you look at what he would be owed if he's fired after 2024, that number is now up to $38.8 million. If he's fired after 2025, he's owed $31.2 million. And if he's fired after 2026, he's still owed $23.475 million, which was more than Gus Malzahn got from Auburn at what was then the richest buyout ever paid to a fired head coach. So look, hand up here, hand up. I was wrong to ever suggest that Venables' job could be in jeopardy if he struggles in his first season in the SEC. Okay? Dead wrong about that. I might have even been wrong to suggest to Chris Plank or Derek Peterson when we talked a lot of in-depth Oklahoma stuff. I might have been wrong to suggest that he'll be on every hot seat list in America going into next season if he struggles. That's the statement that a deal like this can make, even if the base pay isn't as significant as what Pete Thamel and Jimmy Sexton would like you to believe. I can assure you that Jimmy Sexton is far more focused on the if he struggles part than Oklahoma is. And that's the irony in all of this. Okay. Right. Despite what athletic directors would like to present to the world, and despite what agents present to the world, they're actually a little bit more focused on kind of the opposite things, which I think this is a good example of that. Sexton can look at this and know that it is harder for him as an agent and with his client to be able to negotiate that post year three extension if there's any sort of drop off in wins. Okay. Post year three is ideally not the time you're negotiating that extension unless you got a really long-term deal, right? Jimbo Fisher could afford to wait until after year three to negotiate that new deal, because when you get a fully guaranteed 10-year, $75 million contract, you don't need to go back to the negotiating table after year two. The Dan Mullen thing, I always bring that up. Those awkward conversations with Scott Strickland. How much of that was just because of the start of the pandemic where they really delayed everything? They still had those negotiations after year two and then really had to delay them until after year three. And that made for a very strange set of circumstances that I do think impacted Dan Mullen in that strange 2020 season. So ideally, if you are an agent, the way you would like to be able to negotiate is after year two, especially if you're on a 6-year deal like this, like what he signed up with. And I won't buy the whole I can't coach if I have less than 4 years on my deal thing. I would love to see the breakdown of that as well, of how much recruits actually care about that. And they're like, oh my God, this coach only has 3 years left on his contract. Can't commit to him. Don't know that's how that actually works, but athletic directors are so afraid of that they won't even entertain that thought. So look, I know that Oklahoma fans don't want to hear this, but this could be a 10-win roster with a team that does not win 10 games. Okay. If OU does indeed win 10 games with this schedule, it'll be playoff worthy. And guess what? You know who's going back to the negotiating table and trying to get what would actually be a significant raise into the $9 million club? Jimmy Sexton. That's what he's doing. Guaranteed. And if that happens, Oklahoma, in a weird way, is probably sitting there going, hey, That's not the worst thing in the world. All right.
Mm-hmm.
That's the cost of doing business in the SEC. And if Oklahoma gets to the playoff in its first year in the SEC with a first year starting quarterback, a new look offensive line, the biggest area that's considered a question mark for this team, for Oklahoma, that says that Venables is ready for the task at hand in the SEC. If we want to go real into the weeds here, we can point to Oklahoma wanting to make sure that chaos scenario number 10 doesn't play out, and suddenly Venables is Clemson's primary target in a post-Dabo Swinney world. That's real into the weeds, but I'm not going there. And it's June. They're not working against that just yet. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I'm not predicting that's going to happen. That's just a chaos scenario. I do think it's worth understanding all the layers that go into these deals and not simply running with the headline or running with a Pete Thamel tweet. And you have to look at the history of the program and go, all right, what is this? How does this make sense here? Why does this not make sense there? There is still risk in this. Okay. Even the most loyal Venables supporters can acknowledge that the Oklahoma standard is among the best in the sport. Okay. Whether they had joined the SEC or not, that was 100% the case. When you have 16 top 10 finishes in the 21st century, yeah, the standard is a bit higher. I think Oklahoma fans actually deserve some credit for not demanding that Venables has to crank out top 10 seasons from the jump or he's gone. Okay. That guy actually has a much higher approval rating internally than he does externally. It's more the outside world that assumes these things about him. But this is such a pivotal year for the perception of Venables. And I could see it going in a variety of ways. I am more of the belief that Oklahoma's a 9-3 team, and it looks like it would probably beat last year's squad. I think the defensive improvements are coming. I think Jackson Arnold's going to have his moments. And I think there are going to be times where it's like, you know what? This is a really difficult matchup given the strengths and weaknesses of this team. But think about this. The SEC teams with coaches who aren't in the $9 million club, right? Just in case you need a reminder and you don't keep a list like this handy in your Iowa notepad or something like that, like I do.
All of you, few and far between that don't have a list of all SEC coaches, don't worry, we got you.
Speaking to y'all.
Yeah.
Okay, so the non-$9 million club coaches, Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, Mississippi State, South Carolina, Texas A&M, Vanderbilt, and Oklahoma. If I said, Will, I'll give you one of those teams to make the 12-team playoff this year, who would be your choice? Because mine is Oklahoma, and I'm not even thinking twice about it.
Yeah, I think it's Oklahoma and then probably Texas A&M. And then I think there's a pretty big tier gap. After that, it's like, good luck. None of these guys are making it.
Okay, so if Oklahoma plays its cards right, it'll have a coach who navigated a gauntlet schedule, who cost them less money than it did even at places like Mizzou and Ole Miss, who now have coaches in the $9 million club, right? Kentucky is paying that, and I don't think Kentucky has 12-team playoff upside. Okay, we know the history with 2 wins against SEC teams who finished with winning conference record under Stoops, okay, when you understand that history as well. So I think if Oklahoma had just vaulted Venables into the $9 million club, I would have pushed back on the deal. I would have argued more so that they weren't competing against anyone because, look, like if he had a good 2024, he would have moved into that club anyway. So why did they jump the gun with that? But this is more of a contract that acknowledges that Oklahoma isn't planning on firing Venables after year 3 or even year 4. They want stability. I don't think it's quite as egregious as what that significant word suggested in the Pete Thamel tweet. Oklahoma is going to have a chance to get stability. Okay? It's not a given. It's never a given. Nothing's a given in this conference. Stability. Very hard to come by. But it established some sense of stability in a way that's not without risk, but can still potentially be a program-friendly contract if Venables continues his progression. A very big if. And if you're wondering what are the most redeemable qualities for Brent Venables at Oklahoma so far, if you're just kind of wondering, Connor, you kind of buried the lead here. Like, why is he considered worth this money to begin with at Oklahoma?
He moves to the top of SEC coaches that would take him to fight.
He's up there.
Yeah,
he's top 4.
Yeah,
probably.
I think he's the bodyguard. You know, he's the enforcer. He really inspires confidence because he's
no more Coach O. Stoops is still high on that list. You just never bet against a Youngstown guy. You don't do that.
I'd love to see him and Clark Lee just go at it. I'd sell tickets to that.
Clark Lee is certainly up there. There are a lot of guys that, like, I I don't know that they're wired that way, or at least I can't say it with certainty. I feel like I'm like Billy Napier, for example. Like I don't know
Mhm.
Billy Napier in a combat scenario.
Oh,
There's a
he's got that dog in him. He would think he would win the fight from the jump. That's why I would like him there.
okay, but like Beamer could be scrappy
Oh
for
yeah,
all we
Beamer
know.
for sure. Yeah.
I Heupel can take a hit, no doubt about that. Like he can get back up off the mat. There's no
Yeah.
doubt about it. I mean, blindside hits that guy probably saw in college, especially as like a lefty quarterback. Like, yeah, I mean, just saying, throwing out. Okay, we've seen Sark go berserk on that security guard. He
I
won
would
that
not want to
fight.
see Sark in a Publix checkout line. I think that's where he do the most damage. Anyway.
Anyway, good offseason content. We're gonna have to circle back to that one.
Mhm.
But yeah, the most redeemable qualities for Brent Venables, top four coaches you wouldn't want to fight in the SEC probably. He just beat Texas's best team in 14 years. That
Mhm.
matters. Okay, it just does. He's recruiting at an extremely high level. He's using the portal really, really well.
I do want to speak on this because I was going to clean that up later. His recruiting classes have been better than I think they look like on paper, because what they used to be was like it would be like the number one quarterback in the class,
Yes.
two 5-star receivers, a 5-star running back, and then like and
Yeah.
now it's like if you read up and down these classes, I mean in 2024 he got the number one overall 5-star plus like O lineman. I think that matters. Or sorry, D lineman. And then you got, interior offensive lineman, wide receiver, edge, safety, D lineman, like tight end, like big, scary dudes. And that's so different from the Lincoln Riley approach. They're like, yeah, Lincoln Riley may have had the better overall recruiting rating, but he was getting a lot of redundant, like kind of diva style dudes. Whereas like it feels like this is a top to bottom or a bottom to top recruiting strategy where it's like, oh, we're going to rebuild the trenches. We're going to rebuild like these like Hog Molly, Oklahoma style guys. And so I do think that's underrated, because if you compare the recruiting with Lincoln Riley, it feels like he's not doing as well. But if when you saw those people get punched in the mouth that Lincoln Riley brought in, it was not as great.
Dominic Williams was not committing to Lincoln Riley's version of Oklahoma. Okay. And we
Mm-hmm.
talked a lot about that commitment
Mm-hmm.
with the Brian Kelly thing, and that kind of sparked that whole discussion about Brian Kelly not wanting to buy players.
Yep.
Kids are just going to the highest bidder. That was what, like my biggest frustration is like Dominic Williams is looking at what Brent Venables has done with defensive lines at Clemson. That
Mm-hmm.
was the constant force during his time there, and what turned them into one of the best teams of the 21st century in 2018 was built on that anchor of a defensive line, and they recruited so well at that position. Even a Brian Brzee and guys like that,
Mm-hmm.
where you're looking at it going, man, like, okay, that's why Oklahoma feels different. Okay, even if it's not been fully shown just yet on the field, those are the things that they keep coming back to. And they think, okay, this guy can be not Lincoln Riley in the best ways. And that is why I do think that Venables, while this extension will get the obvious pushback of who are you competing against?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you just give him extra money for the sake of extra money? There are some factors that I definitely understand and think are probably going to be overlooked by many who just saw that headline in passing.
Yeah, I think to your point, this is like multi-layered. I think Oklahoma probably needs to just take us. I know that I just compared them as far as recruiting, but that's like an actual measurable change in how the roster is being constructed. I think that like this does feel like Oklahoma is a little bit looking back. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, like Lincoln Riley is a guy who at almost a 850 winning percentage is your best coach by winning percentage ever, right? And I think that what you want to do.
But the Stoops thing is like there was nothing he could do. Like even if Riley had won a national championship, Stoops would have been considered still the best coach there just because of what he built, what he inherited, and what he was ultimately able to do, and the fact that he did win that national championship. That was an uphill climb for Lincoln Riley.
Yeah, I mean Barry Switzer's the best coach ever. Like that's like kind of its own thing. But like
yeah,
I'm talking
different era. Yeah,
yeah,
right. Yeah.
like that's different. But I'm just talking about in terms of like we pretend like as I just kind of did that Lincoln Riley was trash at Oklahoma. In reality, he had a better winning percentage than either of those people. Now we could talk about subjective things. I'm just talking about objective
Yep.
things. So there's a couple of things going on here with that, right? It's this Oklahoma standard which feels a little bit fleeting, right? So to your point, it feels like they're trying to do two things at once, which I think they have done successfully, which is that we are a respectable brand in college football. Anyone would want to coach here, but then also, and that goes to the kind of like Lincoln Riley leaving, we could get anyone. But then the other side of it is we brought in Brent Venables, who Every coach, every school has been trying to lure away from Clemson forever. He came here because of his Oklahoma ties. He's one of our own. And functionally, what this is we're going to figure this out together, right? I mean, this is pretty functionally. We're going to the SEC. We're really still not exactly sure what Brent Venables is, because we could look at the Stoop stuff. We could look at the Riley stuff. All that stuff happened in the Big 12, right? So even if you transported those rosters and those teams into right now, to your point, winning 10 games every year just doesn't feel attainable in the SEC. Georgia kind of did it being in the East, being able to avoid Alabama a little bit, and like LSU, whatever. Like you could kind of get to 9-10 wins, but like just winning 12 games a year, 11 games a year is just not something you can do in the SEC, especially with the established team in Georgia and technically still Alabama that have those roles filled, where that's going to be a schedule loss for them to hit their goal, which they've shown they can do. So I think they're just in a very interesting flux right now where they're trying to prove that they are on a level with like almost like an Ohio State or a Michigan or an Alabama or Georgia, where it's like, no, we have this great brand. Lincoln left us because he's a loser and he didn't want to compete. But at the same time, we have this guy who we're giving him his first head coaching gig. And again, Georgia did with Kirby Smart. Very similar situation, actually incredibly similar situation. Struggled the first year. And again, same deal. Mark Richt, oh my gosh, what a loser. Well, he goes to Miami and he's great. You know what I'm saying? Like, so you got to demonize the old guy to make the new guy feel better, right? So, and with Kirby Smart, he obviously achieved a little bit more in year 2, right? And like the way that these losses are happening are just so weird, right? If you kind of like go through the bowl games and like how they're losing the Cheez-It Bowl and like they're getting Noah Fafita in the Alamo Bowl, except they kind of had every stat go their way. They just kept turning the ball over. So it's just very hard to predict like what exactly this team is on a week-to-week basis. Because exactly to your point, they beat this Texas team that walked into Bryant-Denny and just pummeled them for 4 quarters. And we give them ultimate respect for that. They have in a rivalry game, you have the Dylan Gabriel thing. You have, to your point about the transfer, it seems like they're picking that up, right? And they're getting a guy like Dominic Williams over a guy like Bear Alexander at USC, right? That is more sizzle than steak. And I think that you could look at a lot of the things that are being built here. But it's almost like in reality, you're doing this thing over here where you are betting on your guy's upside, right? Because he's not an established head coach. That's just a fact. And on the other end, you're trying to almost sell me that, well, this guy is a hot commodity. To your point, no one's betting against him, right? Because he's had people betting against him, bidding. Like, he's had people bidding for him, Venables, as a head coach for, we're at this point, 10, 15 years. I mean, because he's been this great defensive mind forever. And so he left to come to Oklahoma. He didn't leave because of this great situation. He did. So embrace that, right? It doesn't have to be the Coach O hire where it's like all we could end up with was this Cajun guy that just ended up here because everybody told us no. That's not the situation. You know what I'm saying? The situation is that because of your Oklahoma ties, because this guy was from inside the program, you were able to lure him. Now that can be, can be a Jim Harbaugh. It can be all kinds of things. But the thing that I would say is just to be a little bit careful with over messaging that he is at that level, because the thing that this is what gives you leverage as a university in this situation, right? I know I'm dropping a lot of names here, but just stick with me. Like where Scott Frost is right now with Nebraska, I promise you he probably wishes he wouldn't have taken that job because money is money. He would have probably gotten it anywhere, but his legacy has been kind of like tarnished. So Brent Venables knows good and dang well he can't leave because if he leaves this place, he left everything for this place. This is his home. He's so happy about it. So that gives the university ultimate leverage, but they don't want to accept that because they just got left at the altar by Lincoln Riley. So they want to just keep making it sound like they're out here winning these deals over and over again. It's like, dude, what you should probably be messaging, and like I said, it comes out in the salary details. That's what's so kind of interesting about it is that they're pitching it as if it's a $9 million raise. They don't have to give him that, so they're not. It's very simple. To your point, they would love it, and they have the money for it, from what I understand, that if he were to make the playoff and silence some of these doubters, they could move up to $9 million, and then you get to do the victory tour, which they're already kind of doing now. That's kind of what I'm saying is that I would just say they need to pick a lane and kind of do the actually be real about what they have, which is hey, again, we hadn't seen Jim Harbaugh as a college coach since Andrew Luck. Michigan was pretty sure it was going to work and it ended up working out great for them overall, win-loss against Ohio State, championship, all that. But those things always take a little bit of time unless you are some freak like Kirby Smart. And no one should ever be compared, as we learned, to Kirby Smart because he just showed up and started whooping butt. So point being, I think that they are kind of setting him up as this It's like, they're seeing their old ex like post on Instagram and they're immediately just like, look at my new girl. She's so hot. And it's like, yo, she didn't have makeup on. Like, let her get ready. Like, this isn't your spot. You know what I'm saying?
There's a little of that.
Yeah.
There's a little of that. I don't think it's the full thing. I don't think this
Mhm.
is entirely because of what Lincoln Riley's doing at USC, which again, I
Mhm.
think Oklahoma is feeling just fine about the way that
Right.
things have developed for
Right.
Lincoln Riley at USC. But I do think that there is something that is so rare, and that is, think about this. Since buyouts became a thing in college football, really the last 15 years,
Mhm.
Oklahoma has never had any moment where it has said, what's our coach's buyout? We need to figure this out and
Yep.
move on. So shifting the buyout the way that they have, while there are a lot of people on the outside that would look at it and say, well, dang, like, what if he has 2 disappointing years? And then, oh, just like that, you're going to wish that that buyout was $15 million instead of $30 million, right?
Mhm.
There is not that fear at Oklahoma because the floor has been so high. And
Mhm.
because when you have a coach like Bob Stoops, as long as you did, and you see the way that Lincoln Riley was able to, whether Oklahoma fans want to admit this or not, he did build on some of the things that Bob Stoops was struggling with at
Yeah.
the end of his time there. And I think Bob Stoops recognized that there were areas where he was falling short. But when you don't have that fear, Auburn has experienced that fear. I mean, LSU has experienced that fear. What SEC fan base in the 2020s, besides like Alabama, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Kentucky, like what fan bases have been able to say like, oh yeah, we just haven't had to worry about our coach's buyout? That's a number we don't even know. We don't even have to entertain. Like,
Yeah.
this is the first offseason where I'm actually looking at Dabo's buyout at Clemson, going,
Mhm.
oh boy, that feeling of confidence, it factors into stuff like this. It
Mhm.
just does. Okay. And maybe it's possible that if a season like this results in 6-6, which again, I'm not betting on a regression like that because I think this team is better than maybe
Mhm.
the average SEC fan will give it credit for. But if that happens, then those conversations change in a hurry. They just do. That's the
But to your
nature of this
point, though, this
conference.
team could be better than last year's team and win fewer games. And
Yeah.
that's what's so weird about this whole thing is that you can't compare this to the old way. You can compare the roster construction.
Yes.
You can compare the philosophy and the talent and all that. But you can't compare that. If somebody wins 85% of their games in the SEC, they're like waltzing into the Hall of Fame the way that Kirby Smart has, where like he could retire tomorrow and go be a pastor and go be in the Hall of Fame. And now you need no, it's a win percentage thing. It's not a games per thing. So point being, like, yeah, I think that's the key is that like they're setting themselves up in that way to be compared because they keep making those subconscious comparisons. And like we smart people, like not we smart people, but like we informed people in the SEC understand that that's not a reasonable objective. You know what I'm saying? So I just feel like all the back and forth over that is just like, who are you trying to prove this to? Because we all know that it takes a lot more to win in this league. I don't know.
It just does. And I think Oklahoma's acknowledging that,
Mm-hmm.
by the way. They very much are, but they get a chance to kind of get out ahead of this before joining the SEC next week. All right.
Mm-hmm. Really quick, would you say missing the playoff would be disappointing for Oklahoma this year?
No. Not with that schedule. Not with that schedule. I'm sorry. Like, there's so much room for interpretation with the teams that they will face that I would not say that. I'm actually putting together my crystal ball before SEC Media Days for the first time ever because I realized if you're trying to do a 12-team playoff, which that's something that we're going to discuss, that's the plan for later in the week is to unveil my 12-team playoff. You can't really do that unless you actually sit there and break down all of these games because there are so many connected pieces and stuff. So like when I sat there and broke it down, I was like, I have them between 8-4 and 9-3 with a little bit of variance.
Right.
And okay, what if you beat Bama year one? But what if you lose that game, to an Auburn team, like on the road, and it's like, oh, this humbling, this is what it feels like every single week in the SEC. This is why going on the road, even when it's a team that's not predicted to come anywhere near, the SEC championship, like this is why this is so tough. That can play out as well. There are certain schedules where like Ole Miss does not have that room for interpretation with its schedule. It just doesn't. But Oklahoma, in my opinion, absolutely does. The more difficult the schedule, the more room there is for interpretation. So no, I will not say that it's a disappointment because if they're 9-3 and miss the playoff and have some of these big time quality wins, I'm gonna be like, Yeah, Oklahoma's really good and would probably beat up on a lot of these other conference champs.
Yeah, so I think there's the answer to the question right there, right? At Ohio State, Georgia, still Alabama, the expectation is the postseason or the playoffs or the playoff. And I think that there's where you are, right? Which is that neither of us would be disappointed in him in year 3 as a first time head coach if he missed the playoffs. So let's be real about that, because that's the thing is, when you do all this messaging and then you miss the playoff, it feels like you failed. And in both of our minds, it's like, hey, you could, not to just drag them for no reason, but you could be where Florida's at right now. Looking at those 2 seasons and saying, oh, what are we going to do? I mean, these are 2 guys that, started around the same time, had similar vibes to them, right, as far as where they came from, and everybody's trying to lure them. And so, point being, I think they should just be happy with what they got. Understand there's going to be a process. Don't compare yourself to Texas. I know it's hard. Don't compare yourself to USC. They're doing bleep all out there. And just say, okay, this is going to be an on schedule long build, which now is a 3 or 4 year build, is a long build. Brian Kelly's still long building his defensive line,
Yeah, very much playing the long game. That appears to be the plan in Norman, especially with this extension for Brent Venables. All right, let's kick it to Jesse Simonton. Great stuff from him, talking all things Heisman, talk some Walter Nolen things at Ole Miss, and then kind of the age-old debate as to whether or not ESPN's FPI is actually a thing worth discussing. So here's Jesse. Now excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is On3's Jesse Simonton. Jesse, that you have something that people are interested in if you go on the big 3, which is Feinbaum, Andy Staples, and myself. Of course, no, just kidding. What you should do is you should just give all of us different takes and just hedge as much as possible. Like deviate from what you actually wrote about and what the graphics said. Be like, you know what? I could actually see it playing out this way. That's probably the best way to go about it this time of year.
Yeah, I think the Heisman, I think the whole conversation is going to kind of take a different tenor, with this 12-team playoff. I think we're just going to have to we're all having to kind of change our brains, I think, for everything with the direction of the sport. And I think the Heisman is just kind of going to be the next thing. Now, it's still going to be quarterback dominant. It's still going to be, the Davey O'Brien Award 2.0 until Heisman voters decide that they want to give a defensive player or more than one wide receiver like an actual chance. But I do think the pool of candidates is going to be deeper, because historically you basically had to be on a title team, or you had to be what Jaden Daniels was last year, which was basically have one of the greatest seasons we've ever seen. And so you can lose a couple times and it's okay. I think now we're going to see a lot of Heisman winners on 9-3 teams.
It does feel like you can have Heisman moments later in the season as well, of like even a guy who's on a 10-2 team can have a Heisman moment where, yeah, maybe the stats aren't necessarily that gaudy, but look at what that player did to be able to get his team into the 12-team playoff. I agree with you from that standpoint, even though, yeah, as you mentioned, we did just have 2 guys that weren't in the playoff that were able to still win the award, albeit on the heels of pretty prolific, at least from a historical perspective, those seasons. So the 10 that you have laid out here, all quarterbacks, you have starting at 10, America's quarterback.
Got pushed back on that immediately.
No. Not pushing back at all. Because like you kind of think about it. You're like, all right, well, what feels significant? Because the only pushback last year on Jay Daniels is, he's not a winner, and that game would have, like those games down the stretch would have been competing for playoff spots. So I think you're actually right when you bring that up.
Yeah, and Colorado fans were really mad that Shedeur Sanders wasn't one of those 10 quarterbacks, and that Travis Hunter, I had him in kind of the honorable mention or kind of wild card type candidate within that column. Frankly, Connor, I think Hunter probably is in the preseason. This can change 6 weeks into the year if something crazy happens. I think as we sit here today in late June, I think Travis Hunter is the only non-quarterback that has a realistic preseason chance to win the Heisman Trophy. What say you?
I agree with you 100%. I got some evidence to kind of back you up here. And I did definitely want to hit on the Shedeur piece of this, because you didn't have him in your top 10. Your top 10 was Noah Fafita, Will Howard at 9, Nico Iamaleava at 8, Riley Leonard 7, Cam Ward 6, Jackson Dart 5, Jalen Milroe 4, Dylan Gabriel 3, Quinn Ewers 2, and Carson Beck at 1. The Colorado fans who push back at you, they probably don't know the stat about how every quarterback that's won the Heisman Trophy in the last 50 years has had at least 9 wins. And I don't know about you. I ain't looking at that Colorado win projection and thinking, am I going to have them for 8 or 9 wins this year? So I think if you play that card, that should take the cake. But I don't imagine Colorado fans were too rational about that.
No, they were not. And, this is the same group that, which is great that their fandom has exploded, but this is the same group that are smashing national championship futures when, as you're saying, their over under win total, I think, is like 5.5. So if they make it to a bowl game, that should be considered a success for year 2 for Deion. And yet there are such outsized expectations that it doesn't really mesh up with reality. And yet I think if they go 7-5, which is not some awesome season, if they go 7-5, but Travis Hunter has 1,200 yards receiving and 6 interceptions or 5 interceptions. Now, these are super gaudy numbers from both sides. But if he does something like that, then I think that he would merit legitimate candidacy. Because, again, I just think the pool of we don't have an obvious front runner. There's no returning winner. The way these Heisman voters go, could they get bored by a guy like Carson Beck because they're like, well, he's on the best team and he's, surrounded by so much talent, or a Dylan Gabriel where they're like, he's put up monster numbers at UCF and Oklahoma. So what if he puts up monster numbers again at Oregon? What does that mean? I think then, you could see somebody maybe slip in.
Yeah, if Hunter and Downs, if they do the two-way thing, that's intriguing because that feels unique.
You don't believe in the down stuff, though, right?
Nah, no. I mean, not to the point where it's going to be even Charles Woodson-like, but at the same time, like, it just depends on how much we're talking. I don't actually think Ryan Day plans to do that when they have all of that talent on the offensive side of the ball. Why are you doing it if for no other reason than to try and win him the Heisman Trophy when we know his job is on the line and it's a team that, in theory, you're just going to talk about trying to get into the playoff? It doesn't even, you want to beat Michigan and stuff, but Ohio State's one of those teams where just be as healthy as you can possibly be down the stretch. And if that would include any scenario in which Downs is getting hurt on playing the offensive side of the ball at a high contact position, you would have to think that would enter into the mind of Ryan Day. But I don't know, crazier things have happened.
And that's why I raised the red flag, because safety is like the one spot aside from offensive line at Ohio State that they have question marks at. That's why you brought in Caleb Downs, because depth and upside there was a concern. I thought it was maybe just a reaction because Michigan folks were talking about maybe playing Will Johnson some at, doing the Charles Woodson 2.0 thing. And then a week later we hear about Caleb Downs. So the Heisman's it's a silly debate because it's the most prestigious award. And yet we've basically just watered it down to being a quarterback only. A running back hasn't won it since Derrick Henry in 2015. I got a lot of pushback from Oklahoma State fans. Why didn't Ollie Gordon on there? And I broke down the candidates by conference before I did kind of the top 10. And Ollie was firmly in that mix for the Big 12. But it's kind of a twofold thing. I think that you're going to have to, I think at minimum, in my opinion, for a running back now to contend, you're going to have to rush for north of 2,000 yards. And you're probably going to have to star for a team that wins their conference. Now, Oklahoma State could do that, and Ollie Gordon could conceivably do that. But they also, then you look at the reality is say, hey, they brought in several running backs to literally ease the burden off him, from the transfer portal. They brought in a couple of guys that I think pretty intriguing. Is he going to get the touches? I don't know. So, if any running back could do it, he's probably the most likely. But I'm skeptical that that's the way it plays out.
I could not agree more. I was going to bring up that number of 2,000 rushing yards. It isn't even just that Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, like 2015 happened, and we haven't seen a running back win the award since then. We've only had one running back, Bryce Love. He was the only running back that's even been invited to New York since then. We have had more defensive linemen invited to New York than running backs in that 8-year stretch. So when you lay it out like that and you're realizing, man, it's not like we've just had this lack of talent at the running back position with Jonathan Taylor and Travis Etienne, Saquon, Bijan, like all these guys, Najee Harris, like we've had studs at the position, and we've kind of all, and look, I'll include myself in this category now as a Heisman voter. We've all kind of just looked at them and gone, what have they really done that's been that game changing? Too many other people maybe impact their success. So look, you lay it out like that, and I'm nodding my head the entire time. If Oklahoma State fans want to push back, they're probably not paying attention to history.
Here's the problem. You know what the problem is with running backs these days, I think, Connor, is that with the offensive evolution and the way the sport has exploded in terms of some of these gaudy statistics, a running back, you brought up Jonathan Taylor. That's a great example. But even someone maybe not even as good as Jonathan Taylor, you have a guy that rushes for 1,600 yards, really good. 28 touchdowns. Awesome. We're talking like Blake Corum, what Blake Corum basically did. And yet, when you compare that to then, Jaden Daniels not only threw for what he threw for and did all that, he also rushed for 1,000 yards and another, 16 or whatever plus touchdowns. So they can just these dual threat quarterbacks now can just put up such raw stats. It's just hard for the running backs to kind of equate to that almost that level of value. And I just think that that's how a lot of voters have kind of looked at it, which is why I think a guy like, the favorites are obviously in the Big Ten and the SEC. But if you were going to go, not a super dark horse, because I like a Jackson Dart or some of those guys, but I think a safe bet or a solid bet is a guy like Cam Ward, because he's going to be able to put up numbers both ways. He's going to get some rushing stats, some rushing touchdowns if he hits in the Miami's offense. And I think, narrative obviously plays a role in all this. And if he's the guy that can kind of lead Mario to the crown there and kind of finally get Miami over the hump, first time they win the ACC championship or something like that, that would be a pretty big, chit in his candidacy.
Yeah, it is something that, look, even if I'm not particularly high on Miami, I can still
I am not either. I'm not either. But just setting out a path.
That's the biggest thing. You just need that path to be there, and you kind of look at some of these guys and you're like, all right, well, are you competing against yourself? Even though Dylan Gabriel is somebody that could end up being the FBS career leader in passing touchdowns by the end of this season, and he could have that mark. It still, you kind of look at it and you're like, all right, well, you're competing against what Bo Nix did last year, and then if you don't win your conference, whereas you look at the Cam Ward path and you're thinking, okay, the ACC, if it doesn't necessarily have a bunch of these heavy hitters at the top, yeah, it's got some depth, but if Miami's path is there, and if they do somehow have this type of season, we know that everyone is going to just crown Miami, even if they're only 10-2, and we're not necessarily convinced that they can even win a playoff game. You're right. Narrative does play a part in it. And you're just trying to find that path for some of these guys, which, I think some of these guys that get that billing in the preseason might not have it in the way that we kind of think that they do.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way about a Riley Leonard. If I'm skeptical if they can win a playoff game or have the depth to truly contend for a national championship, the fact that he would be there playing for a blue blood and maybe put, Notre Dame into the 5th seed or something like that, that would be kind of his narrative. I will. So you tease that I was on Staples, show. I'm on Staples' show a lot. He's on 3 Colleague. I didn't mention this to Feinbaum, but I did mention this to Andy, and I'd like to just pick your brain about it because I think it's an interesting almost side adjacent story to the Heisman Trophy, because I haven't really heard anybody talk about this, and frankly I didn't write about it, but it's just something that I've kind of thought about. The 12-team playoff, I think the pool of candidates is going to be deeper, but with the playoff, have we now killed the Heisman Trophy ceremony as we know it? Because last year Bo Nix gets invited if they're playing in a playoff game a week later, does Bo Nix go to that? Does Dan Lanning go to that?
I think
Do we
you
suddenly
have
are they gonna really miss a day of this year? The Heisman Trophy's on the 14th. The first playoff game is not even a week later. It's 6 days later.
Oh my gosh. Gosh, that's a really good point. And
so, like, are we gonna start having Heisman Zooms? It's just a hilarious thing. Like, people have long said, let's move the Heisman Trophy to after the season anyways and make the bowls or something part of it. I don't think they're going to do that, but if folks just say, hey, thanks for the invite, but I can't go. I got a playoff game tomorrow. Oh, yeah, Jalen Milroe is going to go play Jackson Dart, in a playoff game, and they're both Heisman finalists. They may both just say, put us in a Zoom. Like, we got games to play.
Okay, all that's fair. They're going to have to probably pare down the Heisman ceremony in some fashion, or alternatively, you do what you suggested in the beginning of move it back, and you could still maybe have the voting when you have it and release it, and then just save all the pageantry and stuff for after the playoff ends and have it on a Saturday night or something like that. You're not competing with the NFL that late into the season with that. If it's like late January or something, it's gonna have to change, man.
It's something I hadn't really heard anybody talk about or hadn't really been discussed, and I was kind of just thinking, I was like, man, we might have expanded the pool of candidates, but then nobody might show up.
Yeah, just you got to get rid of some of the pageantry, maybe, if you still want to do it on that timeline, or you're just hoping. You're kind of assuming that guys that are playing in a playoff game the next week won't go, and the only guys that are going to go are the guys that have a bye. That could be it too.
Yeah.
Man, okay, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to dig more into that. We'll definitely have to circle back to that. One of those guys that you were talking about, Jackson Dart. It's interesting seeing Jackson Dart and Ole Miss, involved in all these national preseason conversations, which makes sense because should be the team's highest preseason ranking since the Tricky Dick Richard Nixon administration. But everyone wants to know, can Ole Miss take that next step? If I had a nickel for every time I've been asked that question this offseason, I'm sure you have been asked that exact question so many times. And to me, that's all about those improvements in the trenches. A huge piece of that, Walter Nolen. When you think, how can Ole Miss bridge the gap between itself and a Georgia? It's going out and getting pieces like a Walter Nolen. You put him on your all-transfer team and had him as the SEC's most impactful non-quarterback transfer. What's a fair expectation for him in this defense?
I mean, Lane Kiffin, this all circles back to what happened to him against Georgia last year. He said it explicitly after that game. They just got just railroaded. Quinshawn scored a touchdown or two early, and then after that, they just got bludgeoned, where they could not stop anything. They couldn't stop the run. They couldn't stop Carson Beck throwing it over their heads. And so they went out and got, in my opinion, probably non-quarterback related, non-Caleb Downs related, the number one player in the portal. I think Nolen has that type of impact. He's a premier interior pass rusher. We know that, what gives quarterbacks the worst fits. It's that, pressure right in your face. And so when you pair him with then what they've kind of supplemented around him, you bring back some of the other pieces. You bring back a JJ Paguya inside. Yet you bring Princely over from Florida, so that gives you that edge presence on one side. I think Walter Nolen has top 5 to maybe even number 1 NFL draft potential. So if he hits there, and then Ole Miss hits with what they did on the other side of the ball, which I think honestly has probably been a little overlooked, was we like the Juice Wells and we like some of these other guys. But Kiffin was like, let's just go out and get as many offensive linemen as we can. And let's just see whoever wins the spot wins the spot. And so you get a couple guys from Washington, you pluck a couple guys here. What they've done in the trenches, that they have gone, everyone has said it, they've gone all in. There's these years where it's just like, you have a chance to really kind of, this is your one shot, chips to the table. That's what Ole Miss is doing. And to me, for Ole Miss as a team, not necessarily just for Walter Nolen, but for Ole Miss as a team, it's all about, can Lane start to win some games that he's not supposed to? Because to date, that's been kind of his bugaboo. He can go and beat up on everybody that Ole Miss is expected to beat, but when he does his, get your popcorn ready, they fall flat. Last year against Georgia, fall flat, kind of missed opportunity against Alabama. They got to win one of those games, whether it's at LSU or versus Georgia this year, to get into the playoff. Because I think actually if Ole Miss only goes 9-3 against his schedule, Connor, I'm not sure they get in.
I agree. And I actually was doing the projection of what it could look like if they're 10-2. And if they lose to LSU and lose to Georgia, I'm like, they'd be 10-2. They'd be outside of the conference championship looking in, and their other marquee win is going to depend on the strength of Oklahoma. Like, if it plays out that way, there will be people that are saying, well, I don't really know how good Ole Miss is, and do we just give them all this love in the preseason in part because of the path? But I just think that if Nolen stays healthy, I think that is such a game changer for what they're trying to do. And you bring up J.J. Pegues, and I love Jared Ivey last year coming over from Georgia Tech, and Princely Umanmielen comes in, as this guy that was Florida's best defensive player the last 3 years, and he's already talking about how different it is. Like, that defensive line could be the best in the SEC, and if that happens like that, Ole Miss just simply has to make the playoff, and Lane cannot waste an opportunity like this.
Yeah, I will say this. Here's what's ironic about the statement that you just said, because you mentioned Ivy. Ivy, I think, is an underrated. A lot of people, Trey Harris and Jackson Dart and these guys that they brought back. Ivy is one of the underrated guys that they also convinced, to come back to school. And I think him playing opposite of Princely is going to be very important for them. I don't know if they're going to be the best defensive line in the SEC. And that's partly because I actually think the team that Walter Nolen left, which is hilarious to say, might actually be the best defensive line in the SEC. You bring in Nick Scorton, who led the Big Ten in sacks a year ago. I think this is going to be a breakout year for Shamar Stewart. You still have Shamar Turner inside. So, A&M, Ole Miss, they're certainly going to be right up there in terms of the best. They could battle that out, but it is kind of funny when you think about, we're talking about how awesome Walter Nolen is, and the team he left still might actually be pretty dang good.
Yeah, the Scorton for Nolen trade isn't equal because they don't exactly play the same position, but like two guys that could just pop in the exact, like in their new homes. And I guess it's not a trade because Scorton's coming from Purdue, but you kind of get what I'm saying, that little swap there and the way that it could impact both of those defenses. I agree with you. The ESPN FPI rankings, for me, it lost all credibility about 3 years ago, just at least as like a predictive thing, when they had Mississippi State as number 8 when they came out with them in April. And then they're like, oh God, that's a problem. They were 4-7 last year, and they don't really recruit at a high level within the SEC. Probably shouldn't have at number 8. And then they changed the formula, and then they're number 24 without having played any games. So I kind of look at it this year and go, where did they mess up? And I look at Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is sitting there at like, what are they at, like 16 or 18?
I think it was 17 or 18, because I wrote a column on it a couple weeks back, and I acknowledged the controversy around it and kind of highlighted some of the similar stuff that you're noting. And to me, it's just another, interesting offseason baseline to kind of, what does their analysis say, and what could we glean and what could we not glean? But it was notable that Ole Miss, they had it at like, they were 16 or 17, and it was they were 18, excuse me, because the metric was last year in the 14 playoff, only 8 teams had at least a 20% chance in the preseason to make the playoff. This year it's 18, but it was pretty eye-popping that Ole Miss was the number 18 team. You would think, oh, maybe that's a Kansas State or somebody like that. But no, it was, a team that a lot of folks have, firmly in the top 8 in their preseason polls.
Okay, so if I did take ESPN's FPI seriously, and if I were actually someone that, is sitting down and putting together a 12-team playoff projection and doing that because that's what we do this time of year, what's something that I should actually look at and go, huh, that's noteworthy. They might actually be onto something and not have to come up with some sort of stat correction.
I would say the biggest one is probably because here's what's funny. My biggest criticism with ESPN's FPI is that they got a guy in Bill Conley down the hall who runs better metrics.
Yeah.
So just use the S. Now they'll double dip, so they use the S&P Plus. I will say, at least for them, what correlated the most was that Georgia was a pretty dominant FPI number one, and in Bill Conley's SP Plus rankings, they're a very dominant number one. And I think that's interesting because a lot of folks are putting it in a tier of Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, next group, Oregon, Alabama, next group, whatever. And at least what these preseason rankings are saying, or what these preseason projections, rating systems are saying, it's a pretty clear 1. Then it's 2, 3. Then it's 4, 5. We'll see if that's how it plays out. Georgia has a much tougher schedule this year. But in a 12-team playoff, they can afford a loss or two, and they can still roll through the dance, because when you got to play 17 games, it's going to be about how much high upside talent and depth that you have, and clearly Kirby Smart's built a roster second to none there.
I'll give FPI credit for at least trying to predict instead of doing the thing that I hate so much in the preseason polls. I don't know if you agree with me on this, but when I see a preseason poll that tells me Team X deserves to be ranked this high because the schedule is easy, I think to myself, we've lost all control. So then after week 1, do we change it? Are we giving them rankings based on their future schedule and how we think that's going to play out? And we'll probably be wrong about that. That gets under my skin so much. And I might be in the minority of that. I'm willing to accept that.
No, I think that's everybody kind of looks and kind of assembles these, whether it's coach rankings or power rankings, preseason rankings, via their own lens. But I think that that's a very fair way to assess it, and be frustrated by like, oh, well, Missouri doesn't play anybody, so we're going to bump them up. Where if they had a gauntlet like Oklahoma, we're going to drop them down.
Doesn't make sense. And like,
yeah,
I can think, okay, I'm not going to probably put Florida in my preseason top 25 just because 3 consecutive losing seasons. But if my decision making is because I think Florida's got this gauntlet schedule, then to me, I'm doing this all wrong. And if Florida was coming off of 9-3 or something like that, and then I was making that decision, it just like, what are we doing here? That just wouldn't make any sense. Last question for you. Any preseason predictions that you are workshopping right now? I asked your colleague, JD Piquel, the same question. Preseason take that you are workshopping that you're like, all right, I've got 3 weeks until SEC Media Days. I've got to get this thing right. I've got to get it ready to go so that the next time I go on with, 2 of the other members of the Big Three, it's going to pop and it's going to be really good for the graphic.
Naturally. Well, that's a great question. I'll have to marinate on that. You'll have to. I'll say this: I raised some eyebrows on Feinbaum, and I wasn't even trying. It was totally benign because he was asking me about LSU. I don't think Brian Kelly's in any danger, just like I don't think Marcus Freeman at Notre Dame is in any danger. But I think they both are entering extremely pivotal year 3s where, depending on what happens this fall, we could be looking at a bit of an existential crisis with those fan bases being like, what happened here? Did we get it right by plucking Kelly from Notre Dame? And did Notre Dame do it right by immediately promoting Marcus Freeman? Because it's been ballyhooed throughout this offseason about the Notre Dame, year 3, either make it to a national championship game, or you're probably not long in South Bend. And everyone knows that, the last several coaches at LSU have won a national title. And I'm someone that has Brian Kelly, like 3 on my of overall, head coaches in the country list. So I believe in what he can do. I think he's a much better coach than Orgeron or Les Miles, but I do think they whiffed in the portal, specifically at defensive line, and whether they wanted to pay or not wanted to pay, that could be the difference between winning 10 or 11 games and going 9-3 again, and some folks being like, hey, we thought we were signing up for more.
Okay, so I like that. And I agree. I do think that as much as we talk about the inclusion of the 12-team playoff, not being in it is going to hurt that much more, especially if you're at a proud program and, it's year 3 and you're kind of looking at it very black or white of like, all right, where have we done X, Y, and Z to get to this point?
Exactly.
The take, I think, is then like, hey, I think by this time next year, the most angsty fan base in all of college football will be LSU, because maybe if they miss the playoff this year and the way that it could set up for Brian Kelly. So that's a nice way of saying, like, I don't think Brian Kelly's job is in jeopardy, but by this time next year, this will be the storyline.
There you go. You could really get hot with some stuff about Auburn and Florida too. Those are two fan bases that I think are kind of one I think is ready to get on a rocket ship. The other's ready to ride their guy out of town. But depending on what happens this fall, those narratives could flip too.
Yeah, and Florida fans right now are at the place where if national people say it, they hate it, but they know what they're saying in those meetings behind closed doors amongst friends about
exactly.
Billy Napier and
their text chains are telling no lies.
Exactly. Jesse, this has been great. Looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks in Dallas, man.
Yeah, man.
Will, lad of the week. I'll start us off here. I've got a lot of choices. And by the way, we're recording this before the deciding game of the College World Series. Otherwise, I probably would have just defaulted to that. But we were doing this beforehand. So I will instead go with someone who has already been crowned champion, Celtics coach Joe Mazzulla. In a year, he went from being the reason that the Celtics choked against the Heat to being an NBA champ. Pretty impressive turnaround. In 5 years, he went from being a D2 coach to being the head coach of the NBA champs. Guy's 35. Mm-hmm. 2 years older than me, basically. First millennial coach to win to win an NBA title. Pretty impressive.
Do you remember him as a player?
A lot. Yeah. That's the part that really stops me. It's like it's a little bit different because, I grew up on Steve Kerr with the Bulls and stuff like that. So I have a lot of great memories there. So that's a little bit different. Steve Kerr is 58 though.
Yeah.
This guy's truly from a different generation where I was in college while he was in college. Like I was in my college apartment watching him when it was that West Virginia Kentucky game in the Elite Eight where he went off, and he was kind of like the first true thing I think of when I think of Press Virginia, with Bob Huggins there. So to think about that, and I remember thinking that when he first got the job and, took over for the Ime Udoka situation that was just as messy as couldn't possibly be. And I remember thinking, well, this guy's way too young. There's no way he should be doing this. And look, he is, I think, made himself a hero in Boston, even though that team was obviously incredibly talented. But I went back and looked at Red Auerbach when he was 40, when he won his first title, and compared it to him being 5 years older than Joe Mazzulla. Little different. People age differently back then than they do today. I've always thought that. Just like even in the 20th century, like for whatever reason, people just aged differently. And he looks like he can still throw a few back pretty well on that duck boat. So Joe Mazzulla had himself a week.
Yeah, the championship feels like it's been kind of a long time coming, right? You knew, like, with all the pieces they would get in the Prokhorov trade, that it was just kind of a matter of time. Like, to me, I feel like they won the most postseason games kind of since they got together. They had the organizational support. They kind of moved in and out from different veterans. Really cool to see a guy like Al Horford get a championship. Yeah. And,
Oh, that would have been a better choice for this. Dang, I should have gone. I love Al Horford, man. I absolutely love Al Horford. That was really cool to see him celebrate. Like, that somebody test that guy for everything. I want to know what he's doing, everything he does over the course of the day, because there's no way that he should still be getting after it the way that he is in his late 30s.
Al Horford, the faking being scared of rebounds is funny, but the funniest thing he's ever done is when he just became a sleeper agent in Philly and was horrible for a year, and everybody thought he was washed, and then he came back to the Celtics and was good again. It was like shutting down Giannis. Yeah. So point being, it's just a pretty fun team. I'm not a big Mavs guy, obviously, so it's cool to see that. So I think it's a great choice.
Yeah, the pace that he's on right now, Joe Mazzulla, ahead of Red Auerbach.
There you
impressive.
go.
So just throwing it out there, man.
They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about it being better than him. Anyway, so yeah, my lad, or in this case, last of the week, is Angel Reese. I feel like, we always talk about stories of perseverance. I think that, Joe Mazzulla is an example of that. It's not about, how hard you hit, but about how hard you can hit and get back up. And I think Angel Reese lately, coming off of 4 straight losses to win the way they did against Dallas, where she had 16 and 18 rebounds in a professional basketball game. And then to come, bring it after their last loss to Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever, had a smooth 25 and 16, was just cooking inside. And it was so cool to watch her. It's very funny kind of seeing these two athletes because the questions were always about Caitlin Clark and if her style could translate to the W. And it's kind of funny because nobody really asked that question about Angel Reese. It was like, she's so old school and so like physical, and like watching her just like what all the smoke, talk crap from the beginning to the end of a basketball game while she was just cooking like that was so cool to watch in this win over the Fever. And I mean, yeah, after Caitlin Clark did what she did in the State Farm Arena against the Atlanta Dream, I was actually at that game as our network, but to see kind of like, all the media was, okay, the Fever have this winning streak. They're really playing together. It's all good vibes, and they just beat the Sky. So kind of just like here, it feels like a little bit of and even Caitlin Clark's quote about like, that's not really a rivalry. It's like, okay, man, that's like one thing that's very funny about her is I don't think that she fully understands like her place in this whole thing. Cause she'll say something like, well, you guys are the ones making that thing into a rivalry. It's like, come on, y'all. Like we have the photo of like Angel Reese looking at you like this. Like it's cool to have rivals. It's cool. Like we talk about with drivers, it's cool to have, someone that you measure yourself against. So I think this is just like an absolutely great budding rivalry, even though these two girls play different positions, even though they're from different backgrounds, different places. It's just been cool to watch how they're both not only becoming great professionals and kind of like young, I guess, professional women, but at the same time, how they've both taken a leadership role on these younger teams and how they're, turning their squads around for the playoff, but specifically, talking about Reese and kind of the way that she's been unapologetic, she's been retweeting stuff about just like the W and kind of the shadiness and everything. And I think it's super cool to watch an athlete that kind of approaches this stuff as a younger person, doesn't have a filter, isn't worried about kind of the marketing aspect, and knowing if she keeps playing like this, that's going to be her most marketable factor. So it's just been really cool to watch that. Her and Cardoso up there getting coached by Teaspoon, former Pelicans legend in Chicago. So it's just a lot of really compelling television going on in the W right now.
It's pretty remarkable to think of the timing of the way that the college season ends, and then to play that style and Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark obviously do very, very different things on the court, but like to have the attention that followed them from the college season and then to just go right into it, and they're now like really like hitting their stride is pretty remarkable. I mean, like for all the talk about, the drama of this rivalry and like what people are saying about them and stuff like that, two people to be playing this good of basketball, like on this stage, is unbelievable. Angel Reese is just like a walking double-double every single night. I compared her. I've always thought she was a lot like Joakim Noah. That's kind of
see that,
like where she's going to piss a lot of people off. Maybe even people like within her own fan base. Some of it's just her style, the way that she kind of talks and stuff like that. And like, she's just not going to be for everybody. It's, not necessarily going to be this like modern style or anything. And so much of like what she does is just like this hustle heart type of deal. But I mean, Joakim Noah had long successful career in the NBA. Speaking of Al Horford, and did just fine for himself. So yeah, seeing those two battle the way that they are, man, a lot of people just, maybe certain people that work for networks that might have WNBA rights are, reaping the benefits of it. Some are saying.
Looking sunny for those people, I could only imagine. Point being, gosh, we're now realizing that I was just so close to becoming a Florida fan in that era, right? Because like, Al Horford, talking about Joakim Noah, Corey Brewer, just really cool squads back then. But yeah, I'm right there with you. And it's cool that within the W, you can kind of still have, I mean, it's kind of like Edie from Purdue, right? Like he just is not going to have a star trajectory because of how the game is played in the NBA. It's just not going to work. I just don't think, he's going to continue to be that level of player. But it's cool to see that old school game still works in the W, and that you can, get down low and really just like dominate the paint the way they have. And you really see a lot of different stylistic like the NBA has become so homogenized that watching the W is fascinating because teams are just so different. Like you'll see one team play horribly because of their matchups, and then the next night, which whatever. So yeah, I think it's just super cool.
Yeah, the schedule right now for summer is a little bit herky jerky because of the family reasons that I outlined on our last show. So we will have a normal pod later in the week that will drop on Friday, and then this time next week I will be back in Chicago for the other part of those services and that funeral. So we will not have a pod for the first part of next week, but we will be normal schedule this week. And then, gosh, pretty soon we're going to be at Media Days. And Will, you're going to be there with me this year.
I'm really excited. We've been joking about the MLB draft is there, so it's going to be like me and Tommy Tanks in the same city. I'm really just excited to get out there and see what the vibes are like. I haven't been to Media Days since it was in Hoover, which I know wasn't that long ago, but it was, like I said, I went as a fan. I got to see our guy with the ring on his head. Like it's just something I always grew up around because it was so close to my house. So it's cool. I guess this is my second ever time technically being there as a media member. Because I went once back in the day with SDS. But yeah, super duper cool to do that as an adult and just see the conference and how far it's come.
Do you think we can get Tommy Tanks out to karaoke?
Listen, we got to hit up T-Bob, man. That's the way.
That's the only way. The only way, man. All right. If you have not, leave us a 5-star review. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch every single episode of the Saturday Down South podcast. Follow us on Twitter at the SDS Pod, at Sat Down South, at CJ O'Gara, at Go So Hard. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.